Welcome to Sacred Conversations. Please like and subscribe or even comment. This allows us to be able to reach other people that may not know that our show's out here and get a chance to check out the content. So, thank you for doing all the things. All right, this episode is about understanding and not dismantling. We're going to talk about Genesis chapters 1 through 3. We're going to talk about the purpose of creation and an explained purpose of creation. Faith grows when context is restored. The Bible says faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God. So we're going to take that approach. We're going to talk about who wrote Genesis. We're going to talk about what problem Genesis is addressing. And we're also going to talk about creation and what it actually means in the text. So let's get started. All right. So Genesis was written for identity purposes and around formation. It's not for modern explanation. So a lot of times in our time period or our culture now here in 2026, we try to apply our mindset to those from the antiquity civilization or mindset. And those two you can't because things were understood differently. They had different experiences, they had different um, ways of life. And so it was a little bit different. So I just kind of go into this understanding that how we see things are not going to be the same as how they saw things in the earlier times. So, what the reason that Genesis was there is there was a lot of questions around who they were as a people, who was God, just being able to understand Him and His ways, right? During the time of Moses, the people were under exile. And so a lot of these questions came up during that time from the people, just trying to get an understanding of who they were as the children of Israel. So this information or this chapter of Genesis was compiled and written over time. So think about even now when we have cultures that want to preserve their history and their material, you have people who are scribes who that's all they're doing is jotting down that information. Or you have a lot of ancient cultures, they have storytellers, people who told stories and passed down these stories from generation to generation. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to take a look at um, the Hulu series, National Geographic series with Will Smith as he travels and he's going to different places from pole to pole. One of the civilizations he encounters in New Guinea, he realizes that they're losing a lot of their traditions. And so the main chief of that of those people wants to preserve their language. And so one of the things that they do is they sit down with one of the elders and get an understanding of, okay, what is their language called? And then go step by step to capture the words, right? You think about, taking it all the way back to an elementary practice of naming everything from body parts to things you see visually and calling those things out and making sure you capture that information. So as that elder moves on into the next life, that the children coming up under or the children entering into this world in this civilization, they can take advantage and learn those historical languages or traditions. And so this would be something similar that the children of Israel did was they took a chance to write down everything that they knew, things that have been passed down. You think about from Adam all the way to, um, at this point, to Moses, where things were being passed down from generation to generation. You also have to understand sometimes things are lost in interpretation, or sometimes people embellish stories as well, to make it sound a little bit differently. So those things happened, um, can happen, basically. So why does this matter? Again, like I said, it's not about telling you specifically where I come from, but more or less, who is God? Who are we? And why does order matter? Especially order. It's not about how old the earth was and scientific mechanics. That's why we don't get that information. And that's why there's always been this debate of creationism versus Darwinism and scientific, um, or explanations where people feel like things don't line up, is because that's not what the intended purpose was. It was more for us to understand who we are. God created us in his image. God did all of these things and saw that they were good, right? He gave order to everything. That's really what it's about, right? And so you have to keep that in mind, that it's not about, um, it's more about telling the story of how he takes something out of nothing and creates order. All right. So we're going to talk about chaos. So, chaos, the definition of it is disorder, a threat, a non function. So, you have this vast open nothingness, right? And God takes that and creates order. He starts moving things and placing them and giving them their function, right? He gives the sun to shine during the day. He gives the moon its assignment to be the light to guide during the night. He places all the stars in the sky. He takes the water and separates it from above and below. He takes nothing and forms something out of nothing. Water represents danger, not neutrality. And formless and void equals uninhabitable and non functional. So, as you're reading through chapters 1 and going into chapters 2, especially in the very beginning verses, we want to make sure that we're understanding that that is really what is happening. God is taking things and forming them, and from out of nothing, again, and creating order. God's first act, like I mentioned before, he's not creating anything. He's separating. He's giving everything their assignment. He's bringing everything in order. He's giving it structure, and he's giving it purpose. Genesis 1 is not about where things came from. It doesn't say, hey, here's where heaven is, and here's how where God sits on the throne, and this. No, it's all about bringing order and structure and providing a purpose for everything. It's about how life becomes livable as well, right? He takes all these things, creates spaces for them, and gives planets their function, and then creates the animals therein, and then he creates man and gives a man an assignment, right? Structure. As you go through, and I do encourage you to please read the Genesis story. You want to read it from, and you can take it in breaks. Don't go try to go read the whole chapter because there's a lot that happens in Genesis from beginning to now we end up in a flood till we end up um, with Joseph, and then we end up, well, going back a little bit, we end up with Abraham, and then we end up with Joseph. So there's a lot that happens throughout this book. So I recommend breaking it up, and to allow yourself to do some studying and really get into it. There's some great videos here on YouTube that you can watch um, in regards to the creation story. But right now, we're talking about chapters 1 through 3. And as we go along, we'll add more chapters in and we'll break them down for you as well. But again, so creation in Genesis means assigning roles and functions. God separates light from darkness, He separates the sky from the sea, He separates the land from vegetation. Separation equals order, and it doesn't mean division in this instance. He names everything, right? The moon, the sun, the stars, and then he gives an assignment to man to go ahead and name every living creature, which then Adam does. The word bara means to create. And that's what create, the word create comes from in the Hebrew um, word for create is bara. It establishes function. Good equals functioning as intended. So when you read that God saw that it was good, He saw that it did exactly what He set out to do. This belongs here. This has purpose. This supports life. That's what God is saying when He says this is good. Sometimes when you're reading through things, we try to give things a chronological because what we have as a reference here is time. But remember, God doesn't have time in His realm, right? He's not bound by time. And so we get hung up on, well, this happened on the first day and this happened on the sixth day. We have to just not really focus on that. But to give you an idea of His pattern, days 1 through 3, He spent forming realms, separating light from darkness, taking the water and separating it from land, like I mentioned before. And then on days 4 and 6, He fills those realms, right? He creates the creatures in the sea, He creates the land uh, animals, He creates the fowl of the air. He fills the realms, and then He creates man. And then on day 7, He rests as completion. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that word rest means, because that's the Sabbath, right? And we say God rested. But what that really means is God took up residence. His, his goal was to reside here and commune with us and be one. And so creation becomes a sacred space. Um, I'm going to skip past this because I was going to talk a little bit more about the 6-day timeline, which is what the King James Version does. But just know that there's that 6-day timeline. Again, God rests on the 7th day. I don't want to get hung up on that piece. I just want you to understand what's happening in this creation story. All right, so let's talk about humanity's role in creation. Humans are created as partners, not perfection projects, right? So we talk about the image of God. Humans represent God's care, our shared responsibility, not dominance. We were given the instruction to have dominion over the earth, but we were here to take care of what that which God created, right? When God talks about creating us in His image, image is given before behavior. Worth is not conditional. Humanity's job is stewardship. Again, that word dominance, stewardship. We were given charge over the earth, not control of it. Control belongs to God. Then we move in from chapter 1 into chapter 2. And chapter 2 of Genesis zooms in. It doesn't rewrite Genesis 1. And so we focus in a little bit more on Adam, him being a representation of humanity. And Eve is then brought into the picture as the life giver. And then you have the Garden of Eden, which is a sacred space. And then you have God's relationship with Adam and Eve, which is not distance. He's not somewhere off far. He's communing with them in the Garden of Eden. Talk about creation of women's of Eve. It's more about mutuality, not about hierarchy. That hierarchy thing became something more or less as we moved into the times that the Bible was created. So think about King James, and this is back, centuries ago, where that was important during that time, and also to create some type of moral structure. Um, and that's where those things, in regards to hierarchy for men and women, came into play. She was a helper, a strong ally, not a subordinate. And so that's where um, that distinction happens. Um, that she turned from a helper to being subordinate, right? And that became something that, up until more recently, within the last almost 100 years, that women, and even still to this day, are fighting against, right? And then you have Genesis 3, disorder re-enters the system. So you talk about the fall of man. That fall is about mistrust and misalignment and not inherited guilt. So what happens? Humans seek wisdom apart from trust. Desire isn't evil, but autonomy without wisdom fractures relationships. God gave us, or Adam, specific instructions, him and Eve, specific instructions. They can eat of anything within the garden. All they had to do was refrain from eating of the of tree of good and evil. What came with that? Some consequences when they ate of that tree. The shame, fear, blame, disconnection. And so then God asks, where are you? Now, I don't know if you read that, and knowing what we know now, if as Christians, you're like, God, where are you now? Like, aren't you all seeing, all knowing? But that's an important thing, because you think about it. The relationship changed in a moment, right? They were used to communing with God. There was a shift that happened where they were taken out of God's presence. Their eyes were opened. They saw like God. And relationship is still the goal, but that relationship changed. And we're not going to get into all of that, in regards to the sin and God uh, um, giving consequences. That could be another episode for another day. But I wanted you to kind of understand that that relationship shifted in that moment. They were used to communicating, and I do that because I feel like there's a vertical thing happening um, within that relationship when I think about communion with God. Um, and so they were used to that, and it changed it in that moment. Their eyes were open and they saw themselves naked, and they realized what they had done. Now, how does this reframe the story in later traditions? So, doctrine eventually replaced the narrative. I talked about that a little bit earlier, where you had the King James and the Protestant lenses, where they took literalism. They also used moral failure focused of a lens, and they also used fear based obedience to get early Christians to follow um, the guidelines that they had set. And then from a Roman Catholic lens, you have allegorical reading, you have original sin as a condition, a still centered guilt over relationship. And so the result is that Genesis becomes about control, not calling. But here's what Genesis 1 through 3 is actually teaching: God brings order of chaos, creation is purposeful, humanity has inherent dignity, wisdom requires trust, God seeks connection, not perfection. Because, you know, Adam was 100% what God created him to be. And so that was perfect. And and Eve was that as well. So, some things that you can think about is, as you read through Genesis, or maybe before you actually read the text yourself, you thought Genesis was about, or the creation story, I should say, was about X. I want you to take some time and kind of reflect and understand how were you taught? What were you taught about Genesis? And what changes when you see it as a story about taking chaos, creating order and purpose? Where did fear replace meaning? And what does order over chaos look like in your life? Read Genesis 1 slowly. Identify patterns, not rules. Journal what you see as far as roles and not creating specific timelines. I pray that God opens up your understanding to see his handiwork at display. Again, I want you to like and subscribe and make sure you're following this channel. Next week, we'll talk about Abraham and his covenant, the covenant that God gave him, because that's the next part of the story. Also, like I mentioned before, you can check out other YouTube stories. Um, I'll put some things in the link below for you to check out, such as the book of Adam and Eve, the book of Jubilees. There's other books of the Bible. Again, I'm not going to get into that in this episode, but I want you to make sure so that you can get a complete picture of what Adam and Eve experienced once they were cast out of the garden. All right, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you again for following and being a part of the Sacred Conversations family. If you have any questions, feel free to email us or support us as well. All right, until next time, take care.